Morning, I start counting off states. Maryland, we check out of Maryland into West Virginia in about 30 minutes, and then hit Virginia line when we come through the tunnel, and we just keep checking stuff off. And I get happier as the day goes by. I do like to be home. Continue to pray for my mother-in-law. She was not in the hospital last Sunday when I was here, but she's been in the hospital ever since. So she's been in the hospital since Monday night, and she's still in the hospital. They're still working, trying to figure out what the root cause of her issues are right now. And they're pretty much baffled right now. They just don't know what the root cause of the issues are. And so I think Aaron sent me a message. It looks like they tried one feeding tube and it didn't work. It looks like they're going to try another feeding tube, possibly today, to try and get her, something, all the way into her stomach, because they had her trying to eat after they took the feeding tube out, but it's still not working. So anyway, appreciate y'all praying for my mother-in-law, that they could come up with the root cause of what's causing her not to be able to eat, and if she does eat, to have issues after she eats. But if you have your Bible, we're going to be back in 2 Kings chapter number 16. We did not finish it all last week, and so I want to go back to King Ahaz. And how that King Ahaz was, I guess I don't want to call it a surprise, but sometimes it does surprise me whenever someone is raised by a good king or a good parent and they turn out so evil. And it also surprises me whenever someone is raised by an evil parent and turns out so good, which is what happened to Ahaz's son, Hezekiah. Hezekiah turned out good. And so anyway, in chapter number 16, let me see here. Let me pick a spot to start right here. And we'll start in verse number 6 again, like I said. In verse number 6, at that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath the Syrian, and drave the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. And King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the fashion of the altar and the pattern of it, according to all the workmanship thereof. And Urijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Urijah the priest made it against King Ahaz, came from Damascus. When the king was come from Damascus, the king saw the altar, and the king approached to the altar and offered thereon. And he burnt his burnt offering and his meat offering, and poured his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings upon the altar. And he brought also the brazen altar which was before the Lord from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest, saying, Upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offering, and the evening meat offering, and the king's burnt sacrifice, and his meat offering, with the burnt offering and of all the people of the land, and their meat offering and their drink offerings, and sprinkle upon it all the blood of the burnt offering, all the blood of the sacrifice, and the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. Thus did Urijah the priest, according to all that the king Ahaz commanded. And King Ahaz cut off the borders of the brass, and removed the labor from off them, and took down the seat from off the brazen oxen that were under it, and put it upon a pavement of stones. And the covert from the Sabbath that they had built in the house, and the king's entry without, turned he from the house of the Lord for the king of Assyria. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaz, which he did, are not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. And Ahaz slept with his fathers. They buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. So again, like I said, we read that last week. We looked at King Ahaz, and King Ahaz was a very mixed up man when it come to his worship. He was a very mixed up man because he was not dedicated to any one thing. He was just he would just worship anything. It says that he would worship every green tree in the high places. It said he would send his children through the fire, and actually in Chronicles it says he burnt his children in the fire. And so you see that he was a very mixed up man, and you see in our reading right here how that he goes to Damascus, which is Syria, and it fascinates me that he went to Syria. I would have thought he would have went and found the Assyrians' God, not the Syrians' God, because it was Assyria that he called on to help him. But he went to Damascus, which was Syria, and he went down there, and it's like, hey, while he was down there, he was looking around, and so that is in verse number 10. He goes to meet Tiglath-Pileser, but he goes to meet him where he defeated the Syrians, and he goes down there, and while he's down there, he sees an altar. And so he's down there and he's looking around and he sees this altar and he looks at this altar, and again, like I said, he was never dedicated to God. He never had a heart for God. Obviously, by the fact that he knew which offerings to do. There was a time in his life, again, because his father and his grandfather tried to serve God. They weren't perfect by no means, but they at least attempted to serve God. He understood what, worshiping in the temple would be, and so he tries to incorporate that in also. But he goes down here to Syria and he sees this altar. And he looks at that thing, Brother Parks, and he says, I tell you what, I could worship at that altar. I could bow down at that altar. And again, we talked about it last week, how that whether it's the church building. I thought about whenever we were selling at the time what was Bible Way Baptist Church. When we were selling Bible Way Baptist Church, the building, we weren't selling the church, we were selling the building. There were some people that got very upset that we were selling the building, and I drive by it still to this day. Brother Tyrone works within about 2 miles from it, up there off of Bubman Road, and that's just an industrial section of town, isn't it, Brother Tyrone? I mean, it's just industrial. That's all it is. And here's this church right smack dab in the middle of all this industry. And so we're like, hey, let's move out somewhere else. Let's get out of this industrial section. And everyone except for a few people thought it was a good idea, because those people, it wasn't the church and the church body, it wasn't the people, Miss Jimmy, it was the building that they loved. It was the building that they didn't want to leave. And so we actually lost church members in the process of moving, because they didn't want to leave the building. And they wanted, because they had an attachment to the building. And we don't ever want to get an attachment to a building. We want our attachment to be to God. We want to be worshiping the God who inhabits the building, but not the building because it's a building. And so anyway, so here Ahaz goes down and he sees this altar and he's like, look at that thing right there. And you can make something beautiful. I mean, you can make something beautiful. You can carve it out and put all kinds of wondrous things on there, and you can coat the thing in gold or whatever you want to coat it in, and you can put diamonds on it. You can do whatever you want to do with it and make the thing so beautiful that you no longer focus on God, you focus on that altar. And that is what Ahaz does. He goes down there and he sees that, and I think the whole time, Brother Parks, he had ulterior motive. It's obvious by what he does. He hated God. He hated Jehovah. He did not have any love for Jehovah, and we'll see that later in Chronicles, because basically he just shuts the house of the Lord down. He just closes the door and has them lock the door eventually. but he goes through and destroys everything he can destroy in the process. And he started out by changing the worship, by bringing in this altar, and said, hey, if I'll bow down and worship this altar, not again the God of the altar, if I'll bow down and worship this, other people will bow down and worship it also. So he sits there and he takes his notes or whatever, and he takes his notes, it needs to be this high, and it needs to have this carved on it, it needs to have that carved on it, and it needs to look like this, and I want you to have this many jewels on it, and I want it to shine, I want it to reflect, I want this thing, and he sends it to Uriah. And so you would think that Uriah would get this, and he'd be like, I'm not touching that. If he were truly the priest of God, he would look at that and say, what in the world is he asking me to do? I'm not putting that thing where he wants me to put that thing. I'm not even dare going to touch it. Now, I thought about it, when you come to the kings of Israel, we're talking about a king of Judah right here. It's one thing if the king is trying to do right and the priest is trying to do right. It's another thing if the king is doing wrong, but at least the priest or the prophets are trying to be a check and a balance. A check and a balance. Again, you want two walking together. You want them both going in the same direction. But it's a bad thing, Brother Parks. It's a bad thing whenever the priest and the king are both set out to do evil. I don't understand. You don't really see a lot about Uriah. This is where he's mentioned right here in the Bible. And you don't see a lot, but I don't see where he's mentioned elsewhere. But you have here where he does not push back at all. There's zero pushback. Say, look, king, I don't think you understand what you're trying to do here. There's none of that pushback. Wouldn't you have expected him, Chris, to say, hey, look, I'm not building that. You can take me out of my position and have someone else build this thing, but I'm not going to build that. But he did none of that. He builds the thing, Chris, and he builds it, and you when you read this passage right here, Ahaz is not even in town when he builds it. It's like he stays down there in Syria for a while. It's like he stays down there for a while, and whenever he comes, here comes Ahaz back in town, and the first thing he does is he goes and visits that altar. And so here's Uriah, and he didn't even procrastinate, Chris. My boy's like, Dad, what does procrastinate mean? I'm like, it's what you do with your schoolwork. It's what you do with your schoolwork. You're like, hey, I got 20 pages of schoolwork today. And at lunchtime, you're like, Grady, how much schoolwork have you got done? One. One what? Subject? One page? And you're like, yeah, that's called procrastinating. It was an inherited trait. You learned it from me. But, and my other boy's like, why do today what you can put off till tomorrow? That was Bub's definition of procrastination. But anyway, you understand. Uriah didn't even procrastinate, brother. He just said, all right, King said it. Let's get after it. And Brother Parks, where did he get the materials? The Bible doesn't tell us, but where? Did he take those materials from the house of the Lord? I can't even tell you how many times when you're reading Kings and Chronicles, Miss Jimmy, how many times those guys get in trouble, and the first thing they do is they run down to the house of the Lord and they steal a bunch of stuff and send it to some king somewhere and say, here, I'm going to buy you off with this treasure from the house of the Lord. Where did he get the materials, Chris? He got the materials from somewhere. And he builds this altar. And when he built it, he didn't have it put back in a shed somewhere. He'd already moved it into the temple. He'd already had it moved in. And so the people had gotten used to seeing it. It's amazing what you'll ignore. At first it's shocking, but after a while you just get used to it. The people had already started getting used to this new This new piece of furniture. This new piece of furniture that's in the temple. God didn't tell them to put that thing in there. God didn't tell them to put that thing in there. And so here it's now at the temple, and it's sitting there waiting on Ahaz to show up. It's waiting on him to show up and to see it and say, yes, that is exactly what I wanted that to look like. That is exactly what I wanted that to look like. And again, in my mind, he had an ulterior motive. His ulterior motive was truly to turn the hearts of the children of Judah away from God. He wanted as many of those people worshiping in those high places. He wanted as many of those people bowing down to other gods as he could. You know, it's a shame. It's a shame that we live in a day and age where I don't even think we see how bad it is. This week, my boy walked out on the porch and he said, "Dad, I was just out there. I was just out there on the porch, and at my sister's house, when we drove in, there was a deer bedded down in the yard. And so every night, while it's still an hour before daylight, there are deer just walking around everywhere up there, Brother Parks. And so the deer are just walking around. So, you know, my boys, even though they say there are more deer in Georgia, we tell people the deer must be smarter in Georgia because you hardly see them compared to the deer in Maryland. They're not very smart because they're standing out there. When we left yesterday morning, we're riding down the hill, and the deer's like from me to that thing right there, just standing in the road. And I pull up beside it, roll my window down, look at it, and it's just standing there like, you know, what are you doing here? And so my boy goes outside, Brother Jay, and he's outside, and he's just standing there, and he's looking out, and he's looking up at the stars and everything, and a little girl, 8 years old, walks out, and she says, "You can pray to them stars." She's 8 years old. And he's like, "Well, no, I'm not going to pray to the stars." Well, what about Joseph? What? You can pray to Joseph? No, I'm not going to pray to Joseph. You can pray to Mary. I'm not going to pray to Mary. And so my boy has a discussion with an 8-year-old. Where did this 8-year-old learn that stuff, Chris? She learned it from something she's watching. She's learned it from something they're teaching her somewhere. She's 8 years old. She's not smart enough to know any of that on her own. And so she's learned that from somewhere. And so you're like, it's not a big deal if they watch. I'm assuming some of that probably come from like a Harry Potter or something like that. I'm going to assume that. Maybe I'm wrong. I'll get a text message here in a minute. No. But anyway, I'm assuming it came from something like that where, it's so innocent. And you think it's so innocent, but it's not innocent, Brother Parks, because they just want to get you used to it. They just want to get you used to it. And it's amazing how fast your mind will adapt. You know, I was telling someone, and I'm going to use a worldly example of how fast your mind will adapt. I got this new phone. This new phone, it's the new style phone. It doesn't have a home button. And Brother Parks, my mind adapted very rapidly that I no longer need a home button, but my wife still has an old phone. And I can't work my wife's phone properly anymore because hers has a home button and mine doesn't have a home button. And so I'll use her phone wrong until I'm like, oh, wait a second. Hers is like my old phone, so I have to think about it and use the phone. It doesn't come natural. Anything that you bring into your life and just set off to the side, you'll begin to get used to it. And so they brought that altar into the temple, and they set that thing there, and they're like, we'll just leave it there. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to use it. We're not going to use it till Ahaz gets back, but we just want people to get used to it. Just get comfortable with it being there. Again, this is the priest that's doing this on his own. He's doing this on his own. I know that the Bible says that Uriah does he does everything. Thus did, in verse number 16, thus did Uriah the priest according to all that King Ahaz commanded. But we'll get to that in a second. But before then, Brother Jay. Before then, when he just said build it, he said, I'm going to go ahead and just take it up there and get them used to it. I'm just going to take it up there and just set it out, and then I'm going to let them see it. I'm going to let them walk around. I'm going to let them look at it. I'm going to let them be amazed at how shiny it is and how much it sparkles. And again, those things in the house of God in the temple, they were beautiful, but they were not beautiful to the point that God wanted you worshiping them. God wanted you using them for what they were made for, but he wanted you to worship him. And so Ahaz has that altar built so that you would worship that altar. And so you see that in verse number 12, and when the king was come from Damascus, the king saw the altar. And the king approached to the altar and offered thereon. Again, like I said, that altar is in the temple. That altar was not... Uriah didn't build that altar and say, hey, we're going to take it down 2 streets away from the temple and put it in a building down there. That's not what he did. So when that king saw that altar, he comes in there and that altar's there, and he's like, there it is. That's exactly what I wanted. My father-in-law used to say that all the time. I used to get a chuckle out of it. Whether it was eating a steak or something like that, he'd cook himself something. He'd come up with some crazy concoction, and he'd cook it, and he'd be like, that's exactly how I wanted that to taste. That's exactly how I wanted that to taste. And he said, I remember Brother Jay, he'd say that all the time. It'd be some crazy idea that he'd come up with, and he'd go out there in the kitchen, and he'd cook it up, and he's like, that's exactly how I wanted that to taste. And Ahaz looked at that altar, and he's like, that is exactly what I wanted out of that altar. That is exactly, I was down there in Syria, and I looked at that altar, and I'm like, this is what I want built, and Uriah did it perfect. What a shame. What a shame. What a shame. How would you like to stand at the judgment seat and be Uriah and be like, tell me what you did for me. You were my priest. What did you do? Well, I built Ahaz a pretty good-looking altar. I allowed Ahaz to desecrate the temple, and I just kind of stood back and said, oh, well. Whatever Ahaz said, that's what I did. He was the king. What do you want me to do, God? But here the king comes in, and the first thing he does is he offers. It says in verse number 13, and he burnt his offering. So he brings his offering with him, Chris. He brings his offering, and he burnt his offering and his meat offering and poured his drink offering and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings upon the altar. Again, we're mixing religions here. We're mixing religions here because he brought this altar that was fashioned after an altar from Syria, but we're trying to offer like we're offering to God Jehovah. We're trying to do the offerings that God wanted, but we're doing it on an altar that was an altar for the Syrians' God. What was the end game? The end game, again, was to get the people away from truly serving God. That was the end game. And the devil, we'll put it in 2021 language, the devil doesn't care how he gets you away from serving God. He just wants to get you away from serving God. It doesn't matter if you still feel the need for religion, and so he gets you going down the path of a false religion so that you feel comforted in the fact that you're still doing something. The devil doesn't care. Doesn't bother him a bit. As long as he can get you to worship at a different altar, as long as he can get you to corrupt those sacrifices. You're like, well, I was raised to do this and I was raised to do that. And so I still do some of that, but I'm now doing this. Is God pleased with what you're doing? Is God pleased? Again, like I said, you hear from people and you talk to people, and they try to hold on to just a little bit, Brother Jake. They just hold on to just a little bit. Well, I tell you what, at least I'm not doing that. Well, at least I'm not doing that. Is God pleased with everything you're doing? Have you brought, you're down to like 5% now? That's all you got left? I'm 95% a pagan. I'm 95% an idol worshiper. But I'm holding on to 5% of it. I'm still doing 5% of it like I'm supposed to. God's not pleased with that. God's a jealous God. That's why the commandments are like, you're not going to have any other gods before me. It's pretty plain. It's pretty simple, that he wants you to serve one God, and that's him, and have no other gods before him. But here is a king and a priest that are in cahoots to turn the people's hearts from serving God and into serving idols. And so he comes in there and he offers his offerings, Chris, and he offers them. And it says he brought also the brazen altar, which was before the Lord. And what's he do, Brother Jay? He moves it. He said, that's old-fashioned. It's old time. It's not needed anymore. I've got this better altar. Look what he calls it, the great altar. He said the brazen altar which was before the Lord, from the forefront of the house, from between the altar. Now the altar is the altar that he had made, and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. And King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, upon the great altar. So again, he took the altar that Solomon had made. He took the altar that Solomon had made. That again, the altar was for those sacrifices. It was not something to worship. It was something that you were to offer those sacrifices for atonement of sins, or whatever they were offering for. That's what that altar was for. It was not to worship. But he had his altar. And again, he called it the altar. The altar. A lot of times it's like the car outside. The car outside is different than the car. I wasn't very good at English, but I caught that much. But you understand, the altar. He was saying the altar, which means there is no other altar. It's the greatest altar that's ever been built. Look at this altar, even though it was just a pattern. It was just a copycat of one that was already made. But those people weren't going to go to Syria. They weren't going to go to Damascus. They weren't going to know that it was just a pattern unless someone told them what it was. So he's like, hey, look, my altar is better than God's altar. My altar that I come up with is better than God's altar. And so let's replace anything that God wanted with what I wanted. And mine's beautiful. God's is just kind of plain. It's just kind of plain. It's not really that, And we have to be careful because sometimes, again, if you're trying to sell something, my wife sells stuff online, and there's a philosophy behind how you do it. If you just snap, send a couple pictures in, you don't get a lot of views. But if you know what you're doing and you got your lighting correct and your background correct and you're taking pictures, you get a lot more views, Brother Parks. And so we better be careful trying to replace God and his method with philosophy. We'll bring him in. We'll bring him in with the carnival. We'll bring him in with the puppet show. We'll bring him in with, and I don't have a problem with us having, our fall festival. I don't have a problem with that at all. But if we build our church around, hey, it's a party every Sunday. It's just a big party in here, then I got a problem with it. The fall festival is an outreach. People come in. Hey, you know what? The things we heard about Concord, they're just not true. These people are just plain old folks, just like me and you, and, they're just good people. And hey, Jesus loves you. Come in and hear the gospel. But if you replace it with, hey, we got a bouncy house right smack dab. We took out 8 rows of pews, and we put the bouncy house right smack in the middle, and come in and bounce on the bouncy house while we're having church. No. Hey, we got us we got us a rock band that doesn't call themselves a rock band because they put Christian in front of it, and come in and listen to our rock band. Come in and listen to our rock band, and we're gonna play. We're gonna sound just like the rock band, and we're gonna sing songs. And every once in a while, you'll hear Jesus, and then it's gonna be great. That's what they do, Brother Parks. They appeal to your flesh. They appeal to your flesh, Brother Jay, and you don't worship God. You sit there and like, that rock band's really got it. The songs that they sing are not pointing you to God. They're not pointing you to Christ, but they're making your foot tap. And I like for my foot to tap. You can ask my kids. I like music. And my kids know that I'm a name that tune person, Brother Parks, and you can take me out to a store, and if it's songs that I listened to 25, 30 years ago, I can name that tune within about 2 notes. Bing, bing. Head comes up, and I know what it is. My daughter made fun of me the other day. She said, "Dad, that's that old 80s music you used to listen to." And I'm like, yes, it is. Yes, it is. And so, but you don't want to bring that into church. You don't want to bring that into church and build your church around, hey, you know, we got the best Christian rock band around. But how many churches they call themselves praise and worship? There's probably a lot of praising, and there's probably a lot of worshiping, but I don't know that they're praising and worshiping who they're supposed to be praising and worshiping. I don't know. I doubt. There's a lot of spirit, but I don't know there's a lot of spirit and truth. I don't know how much truth there is. A whole lot of spirit. But he brought that thing in, and he brought it in, and he's like, look what he says. He said, and King Ahaz commanded Elijah the priest, saying, upon the great altar. We're not going to use that old altar anymore. Upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offering and the evening meat offering and the king's burnt sacrifice and his meat offering with the burnt offering of all the people of the land and their meat offering and their drink offerings, and sprinkle upon it all the blood of the burnt offering and all the blood of the sacrifice, and the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. What? Well, why would he say that, Brother Tyrone? Just that other altar, that's now my own personal altar. You use the one that me and you created. And that brazen altar, Brother Jay, I mean, this is a man that hated God. You can, Second Chronicles says that King Ahaz. Kind of like the altar. Yeah, that King Ahaz. Yeah. He was infamous. He was infamous because he hated God. And he's like, yeah, that one, no, you just let me, that one's just for me. So you put a little rope around it, it's over there on the side, and no one can go offer where they were meant to offer. They have to offer where I say offer, but that one over there, that one's for me. You rope it off, and you put something up that says this is only for King Ahaz. Don't go offer where you're supposed to offer. You go offer over here. Only King Ahaz has the authority and the right and the privilege to offer onto brazen altar. What in the world? I mean, I read this, Brother Parks, and I'm like, what? I don't even understand how he survived. I don't understand why God didn't just kill him. Just kill him for what he did. And it says in here, thus did Elijah the priest in verse 16, according to all that King Ahaz commanded. Again, there was never a pushback from the priest. I don't ever see any pushback by any of the people that were supposed to be religious and know better. Not one time do I hear him say, hey, if you want to be an idolater, go be an idolater somewhere else. If you want to be this wicked, Go be this wicked somewhere else. If you want to build an altar like, to the Syrians' God and put it up here in Jerusalem, you can put it here, but you're not putting it here. Not one time it says, thus Uriah did according to all the words. Everything he said, all right, we'll do it. If he'd have said, tear the temple down, Brother Jay, he'd have called in the wrecking ball and tore the temple down. And so it says in verse 17, he goes, and Ahaz doesn't just stop there. It says, and Ahaz cut off the borders of the brass and removed the laver from off them and took down the sea from off the brazen oxen that were under it and put it upon pavement of stones. And so he just goes about destroying the articles that are in the temple. Those lavers were meant, in Exodus, they were made of the looking glass of women. They were made of the looking glass. They were super shiny brass so that you look at, and it was basically a mirror you could look at and see yourself. And those things were made for, Moses washed himself, and Aaron and the priests were to wash themselves in that. And they were to look down into that while they were washing themselves, and they were cleansing themselves. You have to remember that this place was supposed to be holy. It was supposed to be holy. People don't want to hear preaching on holiness anymore. They don't want to hear preaching on holiness anymore. This place was supposed to be holy. It was supposed to be extremely serious. When you came to, whether it was the tabernacle when they were in the wilderness or whether it's the temple now, when you came to that place, it was a serious time. You're like, are you saying we should never laugh in church? No, I'm not saying we should never laugh in church. But I'm saying that God was very serious about his holiness. And he wanted them priests and Levites to clean themselves up. You remember when Jehoiada basically said, all right, some of you guys are clean. You can be in the temple. And the rest of you guys have to stand outside and face Athaliah outside because you're not clean. It was very serious to God that you came and took serious his holiness, and that you worked on your own while you're looking at that, while you're looking in that laver. You look down and you're washing yourself, but you're not just washing like washing my hands. You're looking down and you see yourself. And it was a time of reflection. And it was a time to say, God, forgive me for XYZ before I walk into your presence. And Brother Jay, he said, take that stuff out of there. Why? Because there was a time when Ahaz looked down in there and he saw himself, and instead of saying, God, forgive me, he said, you know what, I'm not changing. I'll do what I like, when I like, how I like, and I don't care what you say, God. And that laver made him feel bad. That laver, when he looked down in there, made him feel bad. And he's like, this is a problem. And so I don't want other people to feel bad because they're now not worshiping God like they're supposed to. So let's just tear it apart. Let's tear it down. Let's break it down. Let's get it to where that's not part of our religion anymore. Just worship the great altar. And just feel better because you're worshiping. Not because you have any truth. Not because you have holiness. Not because you're being cleansed from sin. Just worship because, hey, it feels good to worship. It just feels good. It just feels good. Someone said something, they were making a joke. They said, yeah, I come in, I heard something. I started to get my lighter out and start moving my lighter back and forth. What were they saying? Is, they go to a rock concert and they're playing a little slow song and they all turn their lighter out. And it's a pretty cool moment, Brother Jay. See, 500 Zippo lighters all flicked on at one time. you go to a football game, and they call it lighting up Sanford Stadium between the end of the third quarter and the fourth quarter, and no one has lighters anymore, so we have cell phones, and they turn the lights down real low, Brother Jay, and everyone hits the flashlight on their phone, and they're waving their phone around, and it's pretty cool looking, and it gives you a feeling. It gives you a feeling. But God just doesn't want you to have a feeling without the truth. God doesn't want you to come in and be like, I feel better, and just walk out. He wants you to feel better, but if you're wicked, He wants you to deal with your wickedness before you can feel better. He doesn't just want you to come in and be like, that's amazing, and then walk back out. If you're not worshiping what God did for you and sending His Son to die for you and atoning for your sins, if you're just like, hey, I'm gonna keep the sins and just come in and worship, there's a problem with that, Brother Parks. It's not real worship. It's a form of worship, but not a worship that God's going to accept. And how many people are satisfied with just coming in and having that feeling? And no one tells them any different. People would come in there and they would look and say, this looks different. Well, I guess if it was wrong, Elijah would say something. How many churches do we have in America today that people come to church, they're looking for something, and they have this feeling that it's not quite right, but surely the man of God would say something if it was wrong. But that's not what he's there for. Elijah, what was his motive? Did he just not want to lose the position? Did he not want to lose the prestige of being the priest? Did he not want to lose the power? Did he not want to lose the whatever finances he had? How many preachers today are just hirelings? They're not going to tell you the truth, Brother Parks, because they know if they tell you the truth about what God expects, they might lose their job. They might lose their pastorate. Then they might have to go get, and I know people don't appreciate when you say it, they might have to go get a real job. And I understand, they're 24/7. When you are a pastor and you've got a flock and you care about that flock, it's a 24/7. It's a 24/7 job. People call you at 2 o'clock in the morning. If you're headed to the emergency room at 2 a.m. in the morning, generally the first call you make is to your pastor. Hey, headed to the emergency room. Please pray for me. Please pray for my daughter. Pray for my son. Pray for whoever we're taking to the emergency room. It's a 24/7 position. So please understand, I'm not knocking a man of God, but I'm saying some of these hirelings, it's not a 24/7 position. It's not a 24/7 position, Chris. It's just something that they do. It's a job. They're like, hey, I can do this. I can make good money. They're going to provide me a house. They're going to pay my electric bill. They're going to pay my insurance. They're going to provide me a car. And all I got to do is just keep those people out in the congregation happy. And it's hard to keep people happy, Brother Parks, when those people are in sin and you're not, and you're going to say something about it. People naturally wander off, and they need somebody to put them back in the way. Wander off. They need someone warning them. They need someone saying, hey, there's danger out here. There's danger out here. Be careful. Watch what you're doing. You better be careful. And a real man of God is a watchman. He's going to let you know, hey, this is dangerous. Don't go that route. Elijah was not that watchman. Those people came and they looked and they're like, last year we offered over there on that altar. Not over there, but that altar. But now we got this new altar. Oh yeah, it's better than ever. No, it wasn't better than ever. It wasn't even an altar meant to actually worship God with. It was an altar for the Syrian god because because the Syrians had defeated him. So he said, the Syrians' God must be better than my God because I was defeated. That's what he said. I read it to you last week. I'm not going to get to it this week. But the Syrians' God must be better than our God, so we're going to bring an altar and worship their God because their God defeated us. And again, Brother Jay, the logic behind it was, hey, he called an Assyrian to come in there and he defeated the Syrians. Again, why is he not worshiping an Assyrian God instead of the Syrian God, Brother Tyrone? I don't understand. And why in the world did that supposed to be priest let it go on in the house of God? What a shame. What an absolute shame. And again, we live in an age where almost everything's let go on in the house of God. Almost everything's let go on in the house of God. And people feel comfortable. They feel comfortable. Hey, when I come to your church, I feel a little strange. Well, yeah, you're going to feel a little strange if you're lost. You're going to feel a little strange if you're backslidden. You're going to feel a little strange. You ought to feel a little strange because we're calling you to a holy God, and he expects that of you. He expects you to worship him and him alone. He expects you to accept his son as the only sacrifice for your sins. Well, when I go to that church, I just fit right in. All right. And you might fit right in with them in hell too. Because they're not telling you the truth. Uriah did not tell the people the truth. He allowed Ahaz to take over that house of God, which he shouldn't have ever allowed him to, and he did not tell people the truth. It's a shame. And we may pick up on this next week. We may make it over to Chronicles next week. Again, he's not done. He's not done. I only got down to about verse 17. He's not done. He's not done destroying the house of God. Eventually, he closes the doors, which was his end game from the start. Eventually, it doesn't say what happened to his altar, Brother Jay. I don't know if he took his altar out and said, hey, we're going to keep the altar, but we're shutting the doors. I don't know what he did, but he shut the doors. Thank you. I did get a text message.